Right off the bat, we have a thrilling session on the topic of global leadership on tech regulations and the age of data privacy. Our experts will discuss the problems and possibilities that organizations confront in developing effective regulatory systems. Our panelists include Dr. Sergey Tairyan, CISO of Digitain, Thomas Quilty, CEO and Tech Advisor of BD Consulting and Investigations, Professor Stephen Jacobs, Director Open at Rochester Institute of Technology, and Jason Bay, Creator at TraceTogether. Can I please get a loud applause for our experts?
Good morning. Global privacy and then tech regulation is everyone's issue, not just government. And to that extent, we've got a really great panel here, and I'll be introducing them, or they'll be introducing themselves in just a second. But first, just a little bit about myself. I've been involved in data breaches and such since the early 90s, and before they were called data breaches. And my background now, retired military, retired law enforcement, and I had an opportunity to work on some of the largest breaches in history. So with that said, I'm going to turn this over to Jason.
Thanks, Tom. My name is Jason Bay. I used to be a policymaker specializing in data protection and privacy in the Singapore government. Spent a lot of time working on issues, bilateral trade agreements and data protection chapters and clauses in our negotiations with other countries in the region. Then during COVID-19, I developed TraceTogether, which was the world's first Bluetooth contact tracing app. And now I'm in the private sector. So a mix of both the public and private sector. Very happy to be here, very happy to share.
Hello. I'm Sergey Tairyan. I'm Chief Information Security Officer in the Digitain Group. Also, I'm consulting the government on the security, and I have experience more than 20 years. I was a lecturer in the Armenian-Russian University in Armenia.
For the purpose of this panel, I wear a couple different hats, but for the purpose of this panel, I'm the director of Open at RIT, which is a division that works with faculty, staff, and students to release their work under open source licenses. And I'll be talking primarily here about the recent changes in federal policy that'll impact those of you who are working in things like SCTRs or SBIRs with federally funded ventures.
Thank you. Lynette Attai couldn't be here. I just want to recognize her contributions to our panel here. So, in recent years, the issue of data privacy has taken center stage. Everyone's aware of it seems like every other day or even twice a day there's another breach. And governments have responded to try to regulate what companies do and how they do that. And that's an ongoing problem. And as more people can become aware of the risks, they're becoming more and more, engaged. And that's sort of the purpose of this panel, is to talk about that engagement and how people move forward and how do they get engaged. And so what I'd like to show is starting off with Jason here. Jason, with your background, especially you've been on both sides you've been on the government side helping draft regulations, and then also on the commercial side having to respond to it. It says, as a data protection and privacy regulator in Singapore, and then as a product leader, what were the challenges you faced, and then how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so all very good questions, and I had a couple of points that maybe I can just run through. So I think the starting point is with privacy. You want to find a robust and coherent balance. There's always this tension we talk about between privacy and utility, and to a large extent, it's really all about trying to maximize welfare at the end of the day, right? And this is true whether you're on the public side of the equation or on the private sector side of the equation. On the regulatory side, I mean, Singapore I would say was quite new, and maybe it's about a decade now. We started our privacy regulations in 2012, and then they went into effect in 2014, and I was pretty much the lead policymaker through that process. Awareness, I think, is the first thing, right? As these regulations come out, we started to see more people get engaged. And you talked about, the importance of everybody getting engaged, and I think we saw a bit of that. It was something that started becoming, foremost on the minds of both the consumers as well as enterprises. There are requirements to, put in place data protection officers. So these are things that over time built up awareness, and I think that's the fundamental, starting point, right? At the same time, getting clarity about what privacy actually means, I think it's also important. If you go back to the work of Alan Weston, I think he's one of the seminal figures in this field. And his definition of privacy in the online and internet age is that, it's really about the claim of individuals, organizations or society to be able to determine for themselves, how information about them is communicated to others, right? So I think inherent in that concept is the idea of consent. And so you'll see in many places, consent becomes the underlying basis. But is it explicit consent, or is it inferred, implied consent? Or are there legitimate interest exceptions? I think these are some of the challenges that different privacy regulators, data protection regulators have had to deal with over the years, is trying to figure out, what constitutes consent, right? I think the other challenge that I faced then, and starting to move over into the private sector field, is, and very, very germane to the topic today, global leadership on tech regulations implies that we're going beyond the local context, right? And so when you talk about global, there's a sense of a need for greater international coordination and harmonization. On the coordination side, as a regulator, I know that for a country that's as small as Singapore, we often had issues when various large multinationals encountered data breaches. You said you worked on some really large ones. I'll tell you that the perspective from a smaller country is that oftentimes we're collateral, in the sense, collateral damage, but it's really difficult to work across the board and get some accountability. And so we find ourselves working with the likes of the Federal Trade Commission here in the US, but also authorities around the world that have similar interests. So information commissioners, data protection authorities. There's this thing called the Global Privacy Enforcement Network, GPIN, the Asia Pacific Privacy Authorities, and the International Association of Privacy Professionals. So there are associations that help to cobble together what that global consensus ought to look like. And even as a regulator, I got to say that we've had to really plug in. No man is an island, no country is an island, and that has been super critical. On the private sector side, and just maybe to wrap up, it's also this sense that if you had different regulatory frameworks across the world, then it's going to create a really messy situation, and then you end up thinking about, do you customize your privacy policies for every single jurisdiction that you happen to be operating in, or do we just fall down to the lowest common denominator? And I think to the extent that having a discussion going not just in the local context but in the global context, getting some kind of consensus, articulating common principles, I think that will greatly help companies. I think maybe the last thing that I would end off before Sergey and Stephen come in is I also found that this patchwork or the variation in attitudes towards privacy kind of cuts both ways. So when I was developing what was a national public health digital tech solution for COVID-19, we found that many governments around the world had slightly different views as to what was acceptable. And this reflects the privacy milieus, right? Different societies have different attitudes. But when it came to contact tracing, we found that the big tech companies, through their control of the platforms, in this case it was the mobile devices that we all carry, as well as the Bluetooth protocols that are inherent in those devices and embedded in those devices, we found ourselves in a situation where actually many public health authorities would have wanted more to be done and had different views, but we ended up working under a one-size-fits-all model. And that works for certain geographies and jurisdictions, perhaps like the US, where public health administration is quite fragmented. You have the CDC at the federal level, but the departments of health in the individual states. And there are all kinds of dynamics there. So that resulted in a situation where you had a product and you had a protocol that worked for a specific geography. But I think we are forgetting that much more than the 300 million people in the US, there is a much larger population. And I think we really missed the chance on behalf of humanity even to do something more with the technology during COVID-19. So maybe I'll just stop here, and that's at least a sense of where we've been. And let's do a more open discussion further down the line. Yeah.
Wow, pretty good. It says, probably come back to you on this.
Sure.
Sergey, for you, it says, with all the current and past data breaches, why should an ordinary person care about their privacy? Why should they care?
Okay, it's because big brands, when they launch any new product, they launch as soon as possible to earn more money, and sometimes they don't think about the privacy or security of that product. And it is but the ordinary people think that if they buy a big brand, so the security was embedded by design. And it is the big false, and that's why a lot of services, for example, like Shodan, is very popular. And a lot of people, for example, they buy a smart home with not certified products and chips, and after then everyone who can make a search can see everything that they do in their homes. So this is the one of the biggest problems today, when the awareness of people, because a lot of people think that if they don't understand something, they are afraid of it. I think today we have to change that mindset and say people thinking about their security and privacy, because it is their own job. Nobody will do it for them. I think that is the biggest issue today.
Okay, kind of a follow-on question. What are the issues with companies having our information? And if needed, what are the main points for global data privacy regulation?
I think transparency and some security requirements for the companies that use personal data. For example, I travel a lot and seen a lot of countries in the tourism companies, in ex-Soviet Union countries, also in Europe, when you come to the company, the tour company, and they bring all your data, your passport, your some credit card details, and they work, for example, on Windows 7 machine without any endpoint protection. And that is big issue, and after them people ask from where their data was breached, and you can buy that breached data in the dark web. So I think the one of the points is to make the global regulation for every company, the minimal security requirements about what have the companies who use the personal information to have. For example, endpoint protection systems like data loss prevention. It is not it is not high prices products, but this, I think, it must be mandatory for all the companies.
Great, thank you. Stephen, now to you. It says, what should our audience know to understand the recent changes in the policy, rules, and regulations that are ongoing, and research and potential research that might be available?
So bringing the kind of point of view of academia, where a lot of our research and innovation is based and then gets propagated out through tech transfer, really academics and academic institutions have both a personal privacy issue and sets of regulations they have to deal with. And then there's the data research. I'll talk more about that, but I want to touch, since we've been talking about personal privacy, just to talk about that briefly. Both in Europe and the US, there are always big concerns about student data privacy, right? And you'll have probably seen in the news over the last year or so the EU pushing back against the use of Google's products because of Google's ownership of all of the data, right? So for example, my university wouldn't give faculty Google accounts for many years because they didn't want emails that might have had information about student grades to be owned by somebody like Google, right? So big pushback in Europe on those types of things, kind of less of a pushback here. We tend to be slower as a country, right? And moving on, part of that's because we're so distributed, right? In places outside of the US, there's a much stronger tie between the federal government and higher education and K-12, and so those policy changes happen faster. The challenge that science and research and engineering research face these days is that the peer review process is been spoofed by people putting out false information or bad papers that just have hot keywords, so people will cite the papers without actually following up and doing the peer review. So there's been a move around the world for something that gets called open science or open scholarship, depending on where you are. And the federal governments internationally are getting much more involved in setting standards for changes across academia, and how that's taken form here in the US. And it's important for those of you, as I said before, who work with universities for tech transfer or use federal data for transfer or federal research, federally funded research, is that there's now a mandate that anything that's federally funded has to be open. All right, so your data has to be open and shareable. The first federal work on that, and this is research data, obviously not personal data, but initially the first US federal government efforts around that were only the largest federal agencies had to ensure that the people they fund follow those rules, and that there was a year's embargo in publishing and distributing your data. So you can publish your journal article first and then have this year's jump ahead on everybody else. That has changed. So now all of the agencies, anything that's federally funded, the research data must be made openly available at the same time the publication comes out. Now, to understand, since many of you are entrepreneurs, open doesn't mean free, right? It doesn't mean that you can't monetize it. There are many ways to monetize innovation that's been released openly, and that's another panel for next year. But it doesn't mean you have to do all this work and not monetize what you do. What it does mean is that you will you'll have to be better because people are going to be able to use the same stuff that you have access to compete with you, right? So there's that. But the two big changes were first the NIH released their new data guidelines, and then the US government following NASA's initiative to make this the year of open science passed these much broader regulations. And so it's a big change, and you're going to see trickle down in terms of how that tech transfer relationship moves over time between university research and innovators and entrepreneurs.
Thank you. You may not be aware, but just yesterday, the U.S. and the EU signed an agreement finally. Were you aware of that? Just basically, they finally come to terms on privacy and trying to combining the U.S. policies and EU policies, especially with the EU giving if someone's their data is being accessed, where they have the ability to basically contest that access, and there's like a new court that'll be established so that people can review that. Right now, from what I understand, that's just the EU and this. But Jason, could you comment on that?
Yeah, so I think maybe jet lag is preventing me from getting access to it. I'll definitely check out that piece of news, but I believe it's probably related to something that was struck down in 2020, which was the Privacy Shield arrangement between the EU and the US a while ago. I think this must have been in the mid-2010s. And the idea there is that there are differing privacy standards across both sides of the Atlantic. And so greater, again, harmonization. If US citizen data is traveling across to the EU or vice versa, in a sense, the source country's jurisdiction needs to have some kind of assurance that my citizens' data is going to be protected when it crosses the pond, right? And to a certain extent, then I would need to go into the details, I guess, need to read up and see how this differs from Privacy Shield. But there are such frameworks around the world. I mean, they are woven into free trade agreements and the e-commerce chapters, but I think that's just on a bilateral basis. What's been really powerful is, Privacy Shield, obviously, and this new incarnation of, I think, what used to be Privacy Shield, as well as this other framework called the Global Cross-Border CBPR, Cross-Border Data Regulations, I think, data protection. So APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Community, had the cross-border privacy rules come out, and that was intended to integrate across all the APEC economies, including the US, right? For various reasons, that hasn't been the most, shall we say, top-down and the most effective. It's very voluntary. But I think that's also another model, right, where countries would come together and articulate what that common baseline position is, and then say, look, if this other country is also a CBPR party, then we should be comfortable with the standards of data protection. And so that makes it easier to do cross-border electronic commerce or online commerce, right? APEC CBPR has now shifted into what's been called global CBPR. So I think the idea is not to limit that agreement and that arrangement to just the APEC countries, but to go beyond. And I think from a larger US geostrategic perspective, I think I read this as really an attempt to engage countries in South Asia, in the Middle East, specifically India, which is, probably, right now it's the world's largest population. It's going to be a hugely important market to come. And I think it's important to start engaging some of these large markets in this regulatory normalization and harmonization kind of discussion. So yeah, very excited about this. Going to find out more.
Comment on that?
Other than what Jay was talking about, that aspect of privacy security is not my field. It tends to be more on the data side versus the personal privacy side. And I was having a good day at the slots yesterday, so I didn't see the announcement come out.
Sergey, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is good that we have connected regulation during the two big countries. But the main problem is also that, for example, if we look at the data breaches for example, last 10 years, a lot of companies whose services we use every day, for example, they store user password in the plain text in any database on Amazon server, and it is the big issue because that is a point in the regulation, for example, for storing the password in the plain text or back up the private information of the customers, users, what will happen with the company, And that's, I think, that is the main and the most issue.
Great, thanks. Well, now we got to talk about the future. And so what's the future for us? And my own thoughts on this is your information is valuable. It's valuable to corporations. They want to know what you what you don't like, everything so that they can market to you. So that's from the corporate standpoint. And how you shield your privacy is going to be interesting. So talking about the future, Jason, what are your thoughts on the future of privacy regulations?
So maybe I'll just pull up something that Sergey said earlier on, right? So basic security practices. If you're doing data protection, if you're doing product development, the data protection and privacy bit is going to be really important. I think in development, in product development, in the online space, in the software space and domain, we talk about shift left, right? So the idea that security is not an afterthought at the end of the product development process. So I think in terms of what we can all do, there's a lot of innovation and a lot of new ideas and products coming out here in the US and in many places around the world. If you're in that space, I think it's really important to start thinking about some of these security and basic privacy considerations in the development phase, in the architecting phase, right? That goes a little bit to my experience because when we were doing contact tracing, that's a hugely potentially privacy invasive process, right? You've got human contact tracers asking you, tell me every single last person that you met over the last 2 weeks. And to a certain extent, the digital app that we built is very similar. But that's where, and maybe this was serendipity, because I was also a privacy regulator, when I designed the app, the privacy considerations came in pretty much from day one, right? And that meant, even going to some of my ex-colleagues in the Personal Data Protection Commission in Singapore and saying, look, I'm going to be developing something pretty novel. I need you to walk with me through the consent flow and through the user experience for this and figure out what that consent flow, what the personal data protection safeguards are going to be. And it's going to be core to the protocol that we're going to develop. So I think that's maybe just to broaden it, a little bit of that kind of thinking that I think needs to happen. Now, that's if you're involved in the product development space. If you're on the business side, then I think it's also important to get into the conversation and engage with regulators. I'll give you a couple of examples. In Southeast Asia, in the Asian region where I come from, around 2017, 2018, you started to see countries like Vietnam, like Indonesia, like India come up with data protection statutes that would essentially limit the ability of companies to process and use data across borders. That would dramatically constrain some of the business opportunities that are available, as well as limit the services that are then made available to consumers around the region. And I think we used to believe, and I hope we still believe, in a globalized and open kind of internet society, pan-global. To a certain extent, I think we're seeing, for geopolitical reasons and because of other developments, we're starting to see a polarization of attitudes towards globalization, maybe even a balkanization of the internet. And I think it's really important to engage with some of these governments as stakeholders, whether as consumers or as businesses. And there has been an impact because, in the recent years, Indonesia released its data protection regulation in 2022. Vietnam did likewise through what's called Decree 53, as well as their law on cybersecurity. I think India is working on the Digital India Act, and they've also been talking about a data protection bill. We're starting to see signs that the draft text or the promulgated text of some of these pieces of legislation has evolved over the last 6-7 years. And I think it's important that enough voices get into that conversation because governments do eventually listen, and that's part of their job. And we are trying to figure out what the right milieu and standard for privacy ought to be around the world. Of course, with some recognition that there may be geography-specific allowances or exceptions that need to be made, but within the bounds of at least a broad consensus on what the principles at play ought to be. I think that's important, and that's definitely a conversation that we can all get involved in.
Sergey, what's your thoughts on the future of privacy regulations?
I want to continue what Jason said, and after then I say what I think about the future. Sorry, I agree with you. The problem is where, for example, the life example, several months ago, one fintech startup in Armenia, they come to me and say, please help us to do some regulations. They launched their product in the 4 countries. They had also some revenue from this, but when they want to go to the second step of the venture to bring more money, they said that you have to have some, security and privacy standards. And after then, the startup is nearly 2 years ago. They launched their product. They are launched in 4 countries. And after then, they begin to think about the security of that product. And it is fintech startup. This is where is the problem. Because, as Jason said, we have to build the security in the architecture of the product. But today, there's a lot of startup. You can, for example, Google the last 100 startups. I'm sure there are more than 50–60% of them, they didn't build any security or privacy standard in their product. You know, they think that we have to launch the product as soon as possible and it will be everything good. After then, we will think about its security. And this is the main thing. What about the future? Today, the Google, the Meta, Microsoft or Apple know about us more than we. And this is, I think, in the several years when they also knew, for example, our blood pressure and a lot of things about our physically. Now they know everything about what we're thinking, what we like, and after several years they also will know what physically, for example, blood pressure or something like this about us, and the ML algorithm, AI algorithm can combine it and make us what we wish. They will say us what we want to wish, because they will know, for example, when we are looking at that video, our blood pressure is high, so we like that, and this is, I think, if everything continues as now, we can have a humanitized problem, liberty and humanitized crisis, because our wishes will be enforced by the algorithms. I think in several years we'll see it.
Good, thank you. Stephen, what are your thoughts?
Well, you know, I wanted to point out, Tom, that not only is your information valuable to corporations, it's valuable to the international network of princes who want to deposit their millions of dollars in your bank account, and all those other folks. Your data is very important to them. That's a global perspective, if you will. You know, it's because I live in the academic and the open source world, we see the same pluses and minuses, right? So on the one hand, when an open source project, which is created, maintained, contributed to by a large community, ideally, if there's a large active community involved, if there are data breaches or bugs or so and so, often the community will respond faster than a larger corporation, because more than often for liability, your Googles, your Apples, your Microsofts, when they send you this thing that says, hey, you know, download the update because there's been a breach or there's this bug, they don't let you know that there's a problem until they've fixed it. But you don't know how long it took them to fix it. In the world of well-maintained open source software projects, you know as soon as the breach happens. And then you've got to, you can protect yourself as much as you can, even if it means not using that thing until the fix comes in. But you've got a large community of people who are dedicated to hop on. That's when the open source program or technology is maintained by a large active community. If it's, again, a more entrepreneurial effort or a small group, they may not have architected it well, as we've talked about here. They may not have the community to stay on top of it and do the fixes as quickly as possible. So it works both ways. The Linux Foundation, which houses a lot of the foundations and the organizations that build some of these larger and smaller projects, has their own open source software foundation that's working to build standards and technologies as well. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, that's a group that you can join, whether you're a programmer who wants to help with the programming, or a writer who wants to help with documentation, or somebody who's involved in program and project management. So it's if this is stuff you want to learn more about in kind of a hands-on way, it's something you can just volunteer to join. So it's worth looking at if data and open source security and privacy are of interest to you. You should take a look at the Open Source Software Foundation as folks that agree and work on that. As we get more open, both in research and in our internet technology and these things, we're going to need to see more engagement. And the question is, will the governments and the foundations and all these other folks who are mandating and funding the development of open work, will they resource it well enough so that these standards are brought into the packages and that the communities are maintained to keep them up to date?
We got a couple of minutes still, so I just want to ask a question: what's the role of an individual in this? What can a person do, or should they be doing? Steve, we'll start with you on that.
I'd actually bounce it back to Jason and Sergey in terms of, I think what the individual person needs is, what are the websites? Where are the links? How can they get educated on what they need to do as a personal protection? What happens when the vault system that you've now stored all your passwords in has gotten hacked, right? So, Jason and Sergey, where would you suggest the individual goes for their protection, and the entrepreneur who wants to build a software business hops on to get this kind of information? Where would you send them?
You want to go in reverse order? Yeah.
Okay. Mostly the security companies, they run their products for enterprise, and there is just a little product for the ordinary users. And that's why the ordinary users, if they, for example, don't work in the big companies in some corporate environment, they have to read at first about the issues, about the security, about the privacy, and understand how to protect them themselves. There is a lot of podcasts, it is a lot of videos, it's a lot of books about it. I think it is in today's world, when everything in your phone, your finance, your email, your work, everything, I think everyone have to think about its security and privacy itself, himself.
Yeah, I think I would second what Sergey said. It's really down to education and information. And maybe if I might make a pitch, it's also, sometimes we think of privacy, and I know some people think of it as a human right, almost as a fundamental human right. But it is not necessarily the case that more private is always better. I mean, in the research context, you're talking about sharing of the source data. Of course, I think that there will be protections and safeguards about de-identification of the data so that you're not going after individual data subjects, right? But I think that there is going to be some value for the data, both to the corporate, the enterprises, but also for the individual. I think it's really important that the individuals, that all of us understand that there is some utility we get out of choosing to determine how that information belonging to us is communicated, and then figuring out for ourselves, how much of that do I want to allow in order to derive or benefit from, this, communication of information about myself to other people. It's not a position that I think is universal. Different people will have different landing points. The trade-off looks different. For example, if you're in the middle of a pandemic, where public health potentially, overrides the imperatives of private health, right? Then in order for public health to function, some amount of data sharing is going to be needed, right? In those circumstances, what is the role of the individual in articulating that consent? I wish that we had a different position, because in the absence of enlightened, informed individuals coming together and making their views known, essentially we had big tech dictating to us, most of the world in fact, right? We are going to be in a situation where, because we control the infrastructure, the technology, the devices, we're going to make a call, and it's not going to be up to governments, sovereign governments around the world to articulate and to make a case for greater usage of the data, potentially at the expense of privacy in specific contexts. and also then turning it over to the individual consumer and citizen to say, I consent to the use of this data for this particular purpose. That discussion was never allowed to happen because essentially big tech decided there's going to be a one-size-fits-all model, and we're going to get to decide what everybody else doesn't get to have a say in. That's dangerous. And I think the more that we understand this trade-off between privacy and utility, the areas where they tend to be at odds with each other, and there are also models that we can, work on where privacy and utility can both be maximized without necessarily trading off. Those are the areas where if we had more informed consent, more informed engagement, awareness, and discussion, I think we would be able to build a stronger consensus. And I think that's going to be key. This example of the pandemic that I was working on is just a microcosm, but I think the same issue is going to show up over and over again as we become more connected, as data becomes critical as an economic input and as an input to innovations that are going to affect all of us and hopefully benefit all of us. I think that's going to be something maybe, if I could leave us with, that's in essence, I think, my nutshell for today. So yeah, really important question that I had the opportunity
just to follow up on Jason's, generally personal information in scientific research is anonymized. So you have research boards within universities and foundations, and the kind of buzzword when it comes to deciding as a researcher or an innovator or an engineer who's going to productize, right? The slogan that gets used often is as open as possible and as closed as necessary, right? And so when it comes to private information, personal information, that's closed.
Sergey, any other thoughts?
I think it's about changing. We are all talking about the changing of the mindset of the people. Because with the mindset, when we say we are afraid of it, so we don't want to know about it, we can't do anything some real changes, or we can't be protected. We are talking about changing of mindset that when the people have to really thinking about their privacy and security. Because if someone say that I don't need security or I don't need privacy, I don't have to hide something from, for example, government or some companies. It is the same when we say we are not speaking so much. So we don't need, freedom of speaking anything we want. This is nearly the same. So I think it's all about the mindset of the people, ordinary.
Great. Thanks a lot, guys. And then I'm just going to wrap this up with a couple points, and then we'll open up to questions. Mainly, the main points, keep learning. Keep learning about privacy, how to protect yourself, okay? Be engaged. I highly recommend. If you're an individual, be engaged locally, nationally, wherever that is. If you're at a company, make sure your company is moving in the right direction. Help them move in the right direction for privacy. And then lastly is try to build consensus. If you're multiple organizations here, the more you can build consensus on protecting privacy, the better. So on that note, I'm going to end the panel and open it up for questions. Are there any questions?
Hi, question is, in startup world, when we start building a brand new product, usually privacy is on the bottom of our concerns because it's all about saving cost. But as the startup grows, there comes a time when we need to put that into place. But at what stage would that transition make sense?
If I could start that off, because I'm actually going through that right now with one of the companies I'm advising, and as we build out, it's a social media group, so we're gathering a lot of data on people. And so we're starting off at the beginning as we're building out the app, looking at building privacy into it from the beginning.
Maybe if I can just add, and Sergey has talked about this, and Tom just mentioned that important to get the privacy considerations up front. I'm just going to reframe the issue for you a little bit here, which is if the trust between your startup and the customer is important, right, for continued service engagement, then this cannot be an afterthought, right?
Yeah, right.
So,
There are costs beyond the financial cost.
Exactly.
Right? What's the cost to your customer base if you have blown it? What's the cost to your current entity? Even if you've got liability insurance and you can say, oh, well, it's not going to cost me any money. Nobody can sue me. But that's reputational costs to both your current entity and you as a developer or a marketer or whatever as you go down the road, right? If you're going to have a black mark against you for not doing what you should have done, that costs a lot more than paying another engineer who understands security to help you work on your product.
Yeah, sure.
Advice to you and every startup when you come to the privacy, for you have idea of startup and you think about privacy. First of all, read the 7 principles of the Privacy by Design by N. Chavukyan.
Okay.
You can Google it, and yes. And after then, understand what points of that 7, what principles or what points of them are fit to your company. If all 7, it's great, but for example, 6 or 5 is also good for the startup.
Could I have the name of that book again?
Yes, Privacy by Design by N. Chavukyan.
Okay.
And I'll also mention, I mentioned once already the Open Source Security Foundation. Right, so there are free tools out there maintained by large communities under the OSSF that can help you ensure that security is built into your product without you having to spend tens of thousands of dollars.
That'd be helpful. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Good luck.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions?
One of the challenges that I've seen is at the policy level, there are some very high-level requirements that are produced. The challenge is how do you operationalize this in context? We have a lot of very fast-moving software development practices, things like that. It needs to map against the policies, but it now on trying to translate those policies into operational procedures is something that really the burden is on the company to do that. Are you seeing any movement to bring together operational teams and policymaking teams? Like I know NIST is trying to do some of this stuff. There are some organizations trying this, but if CISO, for example, is giving some clear requirements for small, mid-sized businesses, that's very helpful. But what are you seeing? Anything along those lines? Is there a trend towards making this operational, not just it's a fundamental right, for example, but what do I do with that?
Policymakers never consider implementation. That's part of the job. You shall not think about how to actually make this work. Just decide.
And I'm going through this now. Luckily, we're still small as that startup, and so we're able to integrate policy into the development, and so that's helpful. But as we grow, I can see that being a challenge, and hopefully that doesn't end up in our organization.
Okay, so I think in software development, Agile is very much faddish at this point in time, right? And there's one principle within the Agile movement where you talk about being very clear about what the function of the person in the team is and what their role is. And the appointment may be quite different from what they actually do. In my former team, we used to run squads of about 10 people or so. And oftentimes, the privacy or policy or data protection role is kind of like an unofficial role that gets assigned to somebody in the team, somebody who feels passionate. So I think, in the startup context or in the small business context, you may not need necessarily a full-time person working on it, but somebody who at least has some understanding, has maybe attended a couple of introductory seminars or workshops, and even if that person can just come in and start thinking about some of these considerations up front, I think it helps, because you can never bolt on or retrofit the privacy or security lens into a product after it's been built. I think it needs to go in from the beginning, or at least somebody needs to have at least their eye on the ball.
Yeah, 1 minute.
Oh, okay. I think, first of all, sometimes the policymakers are not technical people, and technical people don't want to write policies. And this is the question. If we can, during the writing the policies, can we consulting with the technical guys who hate policies? So we can create really good policies which will be implemented very well and works. I think this is the formula.
Yeah, I'd also just quickly plug the OSSF again. Hop on there and see what recommendations they have for implementation of policy.
Okay, sounds good, great. And for folks, if you're interested, there is, I think OWASP just recently released the OpenCRE. It's trying to address the same type of problem.
Yep.
So great, thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the question. Thank you, everyone. That concludes our panel. Right on time.
Right on time.